Persecutors rarely try to sweep the church away. They try to control it. And usually they will add a little element into the gospel message, which subtly deprives it of its power. This element is not necessarily wrong. In fact, it's often true. But it has the devastating effect of quietly substituting for Christ. And that's what we mean by mess with the message. Something is added to or taken away from the message of Jesus, so that the power of the message is diluted. Perhaps someone takes away the human Jesus, so we can no longer relate to him as one of us. Perhaps someone takes the divine Jesus away, so we can no longer trust him to make the difference. Or perhaps someone takes away the suffering Jesus, so we can no longer see his glory, which is cross-shaped, remember. But it's difficult to spot this in practice. In China, in the 1980s, there was a Protestant state church called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. It still exists, though it's not as bad today. The government said to the pastors then, if you want to have a legal church, then you must preach this message: love country, love God. Now, that doesn't sound so wrong. What's wrong with loving one's country? But the danger was, the pastors ended up telling the people too much about what a great country they lived in, and not enough about what a great God they were worshipping. A subtle substitution had taken place. The message had been messed with. Christ was no longer central, and the church started to die as a result. The message kept the church loyal to the state rather than to Christ. And in those days, only the house churches kept the faith alive at that time. It's all about introducing what we might call a fatal insertion. Some element, perhaps quite innocuous or quite truthful as far as it goes, is added into the message that subtly, quietly, and dangerously begins to displace Jesus. The early church had to deal with this. The fatal insertion they faced was circumcision. Paul and Barnabas were experiencing a harvest among the Gentiles. But some from Jerusalem said, wait a minute, you need to become a Jew first before you can become a Christian. So they insisted on Gentile converts being circumcised and keeping the law. And they seemed to have a good case. Jesus didn't say he was going to do away with Judaism. And in the Old Testament, circumcision was the sign of belonging to God's people. Keeping the law was the way you stayed in the way of blessing. And a lot of very powerful early church leaders were convinced by this for a time, including Peter and Barnabas. But Paul wasn't. He knew that this was an unnecessary burden to lay on the new converts. Salvation was by faith in Jesus, nothing else. Don't make it harder to be a Christian than it already is, was his attitude. And he felt the whole future progress of the gospel was at stake. So a council was called in Jerusalem. You can read about it in Acts chapter 15. And Peter, who has had a change of heart on the view, declares, why are you placing on the neck of the disciples a yoke that neither our ancestors nor we have been able to bear? On the contrary, he said, we believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus. And his view carried the day. Thank God. And the gospel progressed thanks to a leader spotting the fatal insertion. And he kept Christ central. So we always have to ask, well, what might that fatal insertion look like today? Remember, it's anything that's put alongside Christ as if it is as important as Christ. Maybe not formally, but practically. Brother Andrew always says, look out for those who want a message of Jesus plus or Jesus minus. They're never satisfied with Jesus as he is. So some forms that this fatal insertion can take, well, perhaps when Christians elevate a particular denominational tradition too highly, or insist on a particular kind of ecstatic experience, They're adding to Jesus. It's no longer enough to be a Christian. You have to be a Catholic Christian, or a Brethren Christian, or a Spirit-filled Christian with the gift of healing or tongues. So, what does it look like when we don't mess with the message? When we keep the message of Christ pure, clear, and strong? How then do we revive the church with this? Well, there are two steps to it. First, we have to ask ourselves honestly, what do we have to do to belong to our local church? If it's more than the mere fact of being a Christian, something's wrong. Or is there any group of Christians that you tend to look down on? Because if you do, that also may lead you to the fatal insertion. And the second step is where we consciously seek to embrace everyone on the basis of Jesus and nothing but Jesus. And this can be hard. A priest once said to me, if you really want to follow Jesus, you may have to love others more than your church will let you. So, have you discovered that if you really want to follow Jesus, you have to love others more than your church will let you? Do that, and your church may crucify you, but you will also play your part in reviving it.